I had just turned 64 when my left side went numb in the kitchen. I remember it clearly. It was a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of morning where the air smells like wood smoke and dry leaves, and I had been standing at the counter making oatmeal, the plain kind, with a little brown sugar the way my wife Margaret used to make it before she passed. One moment, I was reaching for the cinnamon, and the next, my right hand knocked the jar clean off the shelf, and I couldn't feel my fingers. The left side of my face felt like someone had packed it with wet sand. I grabbed the counter with my good hand and slid down to the floor, and I sat there for a moment thinking, so this is how it starts. I had enough clarity to reach my phone from my pocket. I didn't call my daughter first. I called 911. That decision tells you something about where things already stood between us. My name is Walter. I spent 38 years working for a mid-sized civil engineering firm in Columbus, Ohio, working my way up from a junior draftsman to project manager, and I retired at 62 with a decent pension, a paid-off house on Clover Ridge Drive, and savings my wife and I had built carefully over 4 decades together. Margaret died 2 years before my stroke pancreatic cancer. Very fast, 4 months from diagnosis to the end. After she passed, I rattled around that house alone, and I told myself the silence was temporary. I told myself my daughter would fill some of it. Her name is Diane. She is 38 years old, lives 40 minutes away in Dublin with her husband Craig and their 2 kids, and she has her mother's eyes and none of her mother's kindness. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it took me too long to see it clearly, and maybe if I tell you the honest truth from the start, you'll understand how a man like me ended up where I did. The paramedics told me it was a thanks in advance, a transient ischemic attack, what some people call a mini-stroke. The neurologist at Ohio Health Riverside explained it to me like this. It was a warning shot, the brain's way of telling you the wiring is under strain. I was admitted for observation, given blood thinners, told to rest and avoid stress. I was placed in a room on the 4th floor with a window that looked out over a parking garage. My roommate was a 70-year-old retired postal worker named Gerald, who snored with the dedication of a professional and made me feel, oddly, less alone. I called Diane from the hospital bed about 2 hours after I was admitted. She answered on the 4th ring. "Dad, I'm literally in the middle of school pickup," she said. I could hear the car running in the background. I told her I'd had a mini-stroke. I told her I was at Riverside. There was a pause, not a shocked pause, more of a rearranging the schedule pause. And she said, "Okay, is it serious?" I said the doctors wanted to keep me for observation, probably 2 to 3 days. She said, "Craig has that conference in Cincinnati this week. The kids have their fall festival Thursday. I'll try to come by this weekend if things settle down." I held the phone against my chest for a moment after she hung up. Gerald looked over from his bed and said, "Family?" I said yes. He nodded slowly and went back to his television program. She did not come that day. She did not come the next day either. She sent a text on the 2nd morning that said, "Hope you're resting. Let me know what the doctor says." I replied with the doctor's notes. She sent back a thumbs-up emoji. A thumbs-up emoji for her father's stroke report. On the 3rd day, a floor nurse named Patricia stopped by during her rounds and noticed I hadn't touched my lunch. She was a compact woman in her early 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the kind of no-nonsense warmth that only people who have seen real suffering can carry without making it heavy. She asked if everything was okay, and I made the mistake of being honest. I told her my daughter lived 40 minutes away and hadn't visited. Patricia didn't say anything dramatic. She simply pulled the chair up to my bed, sat down, and said, "Tell me about yourself, Walter." She stayed for 20 minutes past the end of her break. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that, by the time I was discharged on day 4, Patricia knew about Margaret, about my career, about the house on Clover Ridge Drive, about the rose bushes Margaret had planted along the back fence that I didn't know how to keep alive. She had written down 3 specific things the neurologist wanted me to monitor at home, and made me read them back to her out loud. She walked me to the discharge desk herself. "You have people at home?" the intake coordinator asked, checking boxes on a form. I said yes. I said it the way you say things when you're not entirely sure they're true. Diane arrived at my house the Saturday after I was discharged, 6 days after I'd called her from the hospital bed. She came alone, without Craig, without the kids. She stood in my kitchen with her coat still on, like she wasn't planning to stay long. and she looked around the house the way people look at real estate. She asked how I was feeling. I said tired, but better. She nodded and then said, "Dad, I need to talk to you about something." I should have known from the coat. She sat down at the kitchen table and told me that she and Craig had been talking. She said the house on Clover Ridge Drive was too big for one person. She said the equity I had in it was just sitting there doing nothing. She said property values in my neighborhood had increased significantly, and that if I sold, I could move into a smaller place. She used the phrase "something more manageable" 3 times, and the proceeds could be strategically redistributed. I asked her what strategically redistributed meant. She said Craig had connected with a financial advisor who specialized in elder asset planning. She said they'd already had a preliminary conversation about setting up a family trust structure with her and Craig as co-trustees that would allow them to oversee my finances and make sure my retirement assets were protected. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. I asked her when she had started thinking about all of this. She said they'd been discussing it for a few months. A few months. She had been planning the management of my finances and the sale of my house for several months, and my stroke had apparently accelerated the timeline. I had just spent 4 days in a hospital room without a single visit from her, and she had spent those 4 days and months before them in conversations with a financial advisor about how to access my assets. I said I needed time to think. She said that was fine. She understood, but added, and this is the part I have turned over in my mind many times since she said, "Dad, you have to be realistic about what you can handle on your own at your age. What happened last week proves you need support around these decisions. You can't pretend everything is fine." 64 years old. I had just managed my own medical emergency with clear enough thinking to call 911, communicate my condition to physicians, read and retain discharge instructions, and get myself home. But in my daughter's framing, the stroke was proof I could no longer be trusted with my own life. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. Then I called my attorney. His name is Roy Ellison. He's been my family's attorney since Margaret and I bought the house, and he is the kind of man who speaks slowly and charges fairly and does not alarm easily. I explained everything: the hospital stay, Diane's absence, the visit, the proposal about the trust, Craig's financial advisor. I told him about the phrase, strategically redistribute. Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walter, I want you to come in this week, and I want you to bring every financial document you can find." I asked him why. He said, "Because what you're describing sounds less like a concerned daughter and more like a plan." I went in on Monday. Roy sat across from me with a yellow legal pad and asked me questions for 2 hours. Had I ever signed anything giving Diane power of attorney? No. Had I ever added her name to any accounts? No, only the joint checking account Margaret and I had set up years ago for household expenses, which still technically had Diane's name on it from when she was a teenager, and we'd added her for emergencies. Roy's pen stopped on the legal pad. He asked how much was in that account. I told him. It wasn't everything, but it was not a small number. It was where my pension deposits landed each month. Roy said, "Walter, I need you to move that money. Today, if possible. And I need you to change the account structure before anything else happens." I asked him if he thought Diane would actually do something with access to that account. He said, "I think your daughter's husband has been in conversation with an asset management firm for several months about your estate. While you were still recovering from a medical event your daughter didn't visit you for, I think you should proceed carefully." I left Roy's office and went directly to my bank. I spoke with a branch manager I had known for years, a steady man named Phil who had processed Margaret's death paperwork with me 2 years prior. I explained the situation as clearly as I could. By the end of that afternoon, the joint account had been restructured. Diane's access was removed. My monthly pension deposit was redirected to a new account in my name only. I did not tell Diane. Over the following 2 weeks, I began to understand the full shape of what had been developing. Roy had done some digging, not illegally, simply asking the right questions, and confirmed that Craig had been in contact with a financial planning firm that specialized in what they gently called family wealth consolidation for aging parents. The firm had a brochure. Roy had obtained a copy. It was the kind of document that used words like protection and peace of mind, but described mechanisms for transferring control of assets from one generation to the next with minimal friction. Minimal friction. That is what my daughter's family had hoped I would be. I also updated my will during those 2 weeks. Roy helped me. It had not been touched since Margaret died. The original version left everything to Diane outright. The new version established a revocable living trust, with Roy and a certified financial planner as trustees. Diane was not removed entirely. She remained a beneficiary, but she was not a trustee, and the trust included specific conditions and disbursement structures that made unilateral access impossible. The house on Clover Ridge Drive was placed inside the trust. My investment accounts were retitled accordingly. Patricia from the hospital had given me her card at discharge, just a general hospital contact card, but she'd written her direct extension on the back. I had kept it in my wallet without really knowing why. On a Thursday evening about 3 weeks after I left the hospital, I called that extension on an impulse and left a message thanking her for her kindness during my stay. She called me back the next morning from her personal phone. We talked for 40 minutes. She said she thought about patients sometimes after they left, wondering how they were managing. I said I was managing better than expected. She laughed, and it sounded like something I hadn't heard in my house in a long time. We met for coffee 2 weeks later, then dinner the week after that. I want to be straightforward about this. Patricia and I are friends, and we are becoming something more than friends. And I am not ashamed of it, and I am not in a hurry. She lost her husband to a heart attack 7 years ago. She understands what it means to rebuild a life around a loss, and she does not mistake movement for disloyalty to the past. We are simply two people in our 60s who found each other in a hospital room and recognized something true in the other person. I did not tell Diane about Patricia either. In November, about 6 weeks after my stroke, Diane called me on a Sunday afternoon. Her tone was different, less careful, more direct. She said she hadn't heard back from me about the trust conversation. She said Craig was ready to move forward with scheduling a meeting with their financial advisor, and that she needed me to commit to a date. She said, "Dad, we're trying to help you. You're not making this easy." I told her I had spoken with my own attorney. I told her I had already made some changes to my financial and estate structure, and that I was comfortable with where things stood. There was a pause. Then she said, "What kind of changes?" I said I'd restructured the joint account, among other things. The tone shifted again, sharper now. She said, "You removed me from the account?" I said I had, yes. She said, "Dad, that money was supposed to be accessible for emergencies. What if something happens to you? We need to be able to—" I said, "To what, Diane?" She went quiet. I told her gently but clearly that I had spent 4 days in a hospital room without a single visit from her. I told her that the same week she had told me about school festivals and Craig's conference, she had apparently been engaged in months of planning about my assets with an outside firm. I told her I loved her, and I was not angry at her, but I was not confused about what had happened, and I would not be pretending otherwise. She said I was being paranoid. She said I was letting the stroke affect my judgment. She said this was exactly why they'd been worried about my ability to manage things on my own. I said, "I understand that's a convenient position, sweetheart, but Roy Ellison has the timeline, and the timeline doesn't support it." She hung up. Craig called me an hour later. He was composed and professional and slightly cold, the way a man sounds when he has prepared talking points. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said they had only been exploring options. He said the financial advisor had come up in casual conversation, and nothing formal had ever been initiated. He said he hoped I wasn't going to let a miscommunication damage my relationship with my daughter and my grandchildren. I told Craig I appreciated the call. I told him I hoped we could all move forward in good faith. I did not tell him what Roy had in the file. December came. Diane did not reach out. I spent Thanksgiving with my neighbor Frank and his wife, who had been friends of Margaret's and mine for 20 years. I helped Frank rake leaves. I drove Patricia to a Christmas market on a Friday evening in early December, and we drank hot cider, and she wore a red scarf. And I thought about how strange it is that life keeps making room for things you weren't expecting. I sent Diane a Christmas card. I signed it, "Love, Dad." I included a photo of the rose bushes along the back fence. They had survived the fall. Barely. And I had figured out the pruning. Margaret would have been pleased. Diane sent a card in return. It was signed by all 4 of them. The grandchildren had drawn small figures at the bottom, stick people with oversized heads and enormous smiles. I put it on the mantel. In January, about 3 months after everything had shifted between us, Diane came to the house alone. She didn't call first. I saw her car in the driveway from the kitchen window, and I stood there for a moment before opening the door. She came in and sat at the kitchen table again, but this time she took her coat off. She looked tired. Not the tired of a busy schedule, the tired of having thought about something difficult for a long time. She put her hands flat on the table the way her mother used to do when she was about to say something true, and I noticed the gesture, and it went through me like a cold wire. She said, "Dad, Craig was driving most of that, the financial stuff. I went along with it because I was scared after your stroke, and he framed it as protecting you. But I know how it must have looked, and I know I didn't come to the hospital, and I don't have a good excuse for that. I panicked, and then I waited too long, and then I didn't know how to show up after waiting too long." I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, "I'm not asking you to change anything you changed. I'm just asking if we can still talk." I poured 2 cups of coffee. I set one in front of her. I sat down across from her, and I thought about Margaret. And I thought about what it costs a person to walk into a room and admit they were wrong. And I thought about the grandchildren with the stick figures and the enormous smiles. I said, "Tell me about the kids." She talked for almost an hour. I listened. We did not solve everything that afternoon. Some things between parents and children don't get solved. They just get carried differently as time goes on. But we talked, and that was something. And when she left, she hugged me at the door longer than she had in years. Craig and I have not had another conversation about finances. Roy Ellison still has the file. My will and my trust remain exactly as rewritten. Patricia came over for dinner the following Saturday, and I told her about the visit, and she said, "That's a beginning, Walter," and I thought that was probably the right way to put it. I think about the morning of my stroke sometimes. I think about the oatmeal in the cinnamon jar, and sliding down to the floor, and having enough clarity to call 911 before I called anyone else. I used to feel sad about that my instinct in a crisis was not to reach for my daughter's number. Now, I think it was simply honest about where we were. And honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is the only place you can start from if you want to build something real. The rose bushes came back in the spring. Better than I expected, fuller along the fence than even the year before. I don't know exactly what I did right. Sometimes things just survive on their own terms, given a little time and room enough to breathe. I'm 64 years old, and I live alone in a house that is entirely my own, and I have a good attorney and a new account at a bank I trust, and a woman in a red scarf who makes me feel like the world still has things worth showing up for. My daughter and I are talking again, slowly and carefully, the way you learn to walk after something that nearly took you down. It is not the ending I planned, but I have stopped expecting endings to arrive the way you planned them. I just try to make sure that whatever comes next, I am standing on solid ground when it gets here. And I am. For the first time in a long time, I really am.